It has been a privilege this year to have spent 4 weeks in Sudan working with a small team. The main part of the time was spent in the three central offices, the provincial office in Khartoum, the Darsan office in Omdurman, and at the Ministry Training Institute. But we also journeyed out to townships on the outskirts to see something of the life and work of the church there. We flew out to Port Sudan, and from there we journeyed 750 miles by coach down to Wad Medani. To understand that distance, if you started in Brighton and drove north 750 miles, you'd finish up in the sea off the top edge of Scotland. It was a long, hard ride, taking 14 hours, but the visits were really worthwhile. We sat with church leaders in their place. The main features of life in Sudan at the moment are demonstrations and inflation. Major demonstrations are taking place twice a week in all the major cities and towns. On those days, all work and movement have to stop as roads are blocked. For their own safety, visitors have to be in lockdown in their hotel. I'll refer to this again in a moment, but the other main aspect of life today in Sudan is inflation, which is absolutely rampant. In Britain, looking at this graph, we're experiencing life at the left-hand end, which is nothing compared to the current rate in Sudan. In 2020, the IMF required subsidies to be taken off from all goods, including food and fuel. The economy's been totally destabilised. In IMF terms, there's no pain without gain, but the most excruciating pain is felt by the poorest, the community where the Sudanese church is strongest. How are the churches surviving in all this? Outwardly, patterns of life continue much the same. There's the same vigour in worship and the same delight in meeting. Archbishop Ezekiel, together with his assistant bishop Fajak, recently confirmed 163 people at one service, and ordinations are continuing too. This photo is of Maki Eldunki. He has recently been appointed to handle TEE, Theological Education by Extension, working across the whole province. He's holding the first copies of completely refreshed TEE materials produced in Arabic. Our Church Association trustees have been key facilitators of this material, and the funding for the work's been obtained from Lambeth Palace and a charity called Relay Trust. TEE takes ministry training out from the institute in Omdurman to where people are, anywhere in Sudan. Another new appointment is Bello El Baluk, shown here with Rhys North, a community accountant who travelled with us. Bello has been appointed as Provincial Relief and Development Officer. He travelled with us learning how partners look at projects and what information and accounting they are required. He's now been sent for formal training in Nairobi using Anglican Communion funding, but again facilitated by our church association. In this photo, Rhys is seen with two treasurers, Isa Ibrahim of Khartoum Diocese and Hindi Luka from the provincial office. They are being given in-service training, helping them produce final accounts that satisfy British charity standards, work which again is supported with time and expertise from our church association. A particular plea voiced by Bishop Samana Wad Medani was "set our hands free." He was speaking out of frustration at his inability to develop any work due to lack of funds. In response, in recent years, the Diocese of Leeds has put an emphasis on funding income generation schemes. We arrived in Wad Medani at night and found a whole row of shops newly completed and now beginning to be rented out. Unusual in Sudan, Bishop Saman has said that income from one of the shops will be given to the Mothers' Union and another to youth work. In Khartoum, we saw building work for a provincial guest house. It started in 2018, part of a 5-year strategy by Archbishop Ezekiel to enable the Episcopal Church to be less dependent on grants. Watching the men working on a hot day with the temperature over 40 degrees centigrade, producing a continuous flow of mixed cement, was absolutely stunning. I have never seen Sudanese work so hard. This is the building as it now stands. On the ground floor, it's already had fixtures and fittings installed and is ready to rent out. The ground floor has a conference hall and 2 guest rooms. Work on more guest rooms on the upper floor has yet to begin. Our church association has received a fully worked business plan for this project, asking us to invest in it as a major donor. As part of the visit, we were also able to hand deliver funding that Lambeth has given to fund a House of Bishops meeting. It's the first time they've been able to all meet together for 3 years. Their meeting was facilitated by Archbishop Munir of Egypt, bringing wider knowledge to the discussions. They were preparing for the Lambeth Conference and for a general synod to be held later this year. They were also thinking about a new strategic plan for the province for the coming years and receiving spiritual refreshment. Their wives attended also, copying the example set by the Archbishop of Canterbury. So what is the life and situation of the church like in Sudan today? It's showing great resilience, but it's not hard also to feel the fragility of the context. To me, it felt as if the work is being stalked by the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse. They are waiting for a tipping point that feels very close, ready with an avalanche of devastation that would wipe away so much that has been achieved. First, I'm thinking of the demonstrations of the conflict which has no end in sight. Unarmed demonstrators are being met by the military with lethal force. Sheltering in our hotel during more than one of the demonstrations, we clearly heard the crack of gunfire, the thump of tear gas grenades being launched, and then a third sound as they exploded. We were close to the action, but perfectly safe where we were. With us was a trustee from the Women's Educational Partnership, which majors on literacy and orphanages. She says their officers have always been non-political, but now she finds on the day after a demonstration, workers come into the office significantly bruised and injured, having taken part in the marches. I happened to be there in 2019 when Bashir was overthrown. There was much artwork at that time expressing the voice of demonstrators. These posters say, "We coexist and are equal by our constitution," and "Diverse voices, one constitution." But this is no longer the expressed aim of what's happening. There's a refusal to dialogue with the army and a fragmented political approach. The aim is to re-establish democracy, but there's no agreed political consensus for a way forward. In many parts of Sudan, we find signs of the second horseman. There's much community tension. Compared with the confrontation with the army and the police, far more people are being murdered every month in tribal disagreements and intercommunal violence because of the breakdown of law and order and the sense of lack of justice. This is resulting in banditry. In the Nuba Mountains in Darfur, there are groups of young men with automatic rifles acting as highwaymen. This is a photo of Kimbir, a church Bible translator who had gone to the Nuba Mountains to launch a new translation. Making his way back, travelling with a group of market traders, they were stopped by an armed gang on motorbikes. The tradesmen were robbed of their livelihoods and Kimbir was shot dead. These happenings bring fear to the community, affecting normal life, and it reaches right into the city. At High Baraka in Haj Yusuf, North Khartoum, there was an evening service of 300 people. The photo is from 2018. This year, I found that the service had been shut down because after the service, when congregation members were leaving the church, they had been targeted, attacked by thugs who stole from them. I felt that morning services also seem to have reduced numbers. Because of inflation, people can no longer afford to use public transport to get to church. There's an increased pressure on the churches too from the reassertion of Islamism in what was to have been a secular state. The Presbyterian Church has suffered particularly recently the arrest of some church leaders and seizure of church property. The third horseman represented famine. Here you see the Reverend Dr. Isaac Cody, Khartoum Diocesan Relief and Development Officer, together with El Hadi, our driver. We'd been out to a church centre in one of the desert townships on the edge of Omdurman and stopped on the way back at a diner. The food was quite basic, fried river fish with bread. We asked Isaac whether he would bring his family to a place like this, and he said no, it was unaffordable. He himself had not been paid for 9 weeks because diocesan income is not keeping up with rising costs. This represents a tragic setback in terms of the ability of the diocese. In years past, say 10 years ago, life was like that, but in current years they'd risen above it because of the income generation work that's been going on. The fact is that there's food in the marketplace, but people cannot afford it. Women work late at night trying to make a living by selling tea. Their families are dependent on the money that they bring in because income is down and prices are up. Children are being kept off school because their parents cannot afford to pay school fees, affecting the whole life of the next generation. It isn't just the price of basic foods that is a problem. The price of water is also. People cannot afford to buy as much as they did. In the townships, water is brought in by tanker, then taken out to houses in barrels on donkey carts, and people buy their house supply from that. With the price rising, they have to cut back on washing and laundry, and this affects health. And that's where again I see the fragility of life and the fourth horseman hovering. There are no medicines or access to health care. If people are sick, there's no help for many, and that impinges especially on the life of women and young children. We've no experience of life like this. What struck me most is how amazingly resilient the people were. They're dealing with tough realities and do it with such grace. They live in conditions most of us would struggle with, but they keep on going. It seems to me that the Nuba people have a heritage of suffering. There have been repeated attempts to snuff out the Nuba life, and so for them, life in Sudan today has something unexceptional about it. Life was slowly getting better, but now it is just another time to tighten the belt. And I've seen it all before, so there's not great levels of complaint, just an acceptance of life as it is. To finish on a more hopeful note, like anyone, the Sudanese have hopes and aspirations for their children. In a township west of Omdurman, we came upon an infant school. Here you see something of life struggling to continue as normal and the high hopes that parents have. On the board in this classroom, one could see they were learning their numbers. On the notice board on the side, there were lots of photographs of the previous year's children graduating to primary school, showing the pride of the parents and the desire for something good for their children. The children are singing of the love of Jesus, and as the song progresses, they sing not just that Jesus loves them, but they must love one another too. And at that point you see them embrace each other.
Let us love one another.
The church is alive and people find their faith precious. They want their children to know the love of God in Christ. We must continue to pray for the church in Sudan and to work with them through their problems towards, please God, a better future.